Not half as impossible. Written by 47 professors. Read by Arashi. Ever since returning from the void of nihility, all of Aventurine's routines have been uprooted. Number 1. Gone are the mornings he could stretch his limbs on sheets with thread counts that would make even the richest of the galaxies raise a brow at, lazing about like a cat until the sunlight bothers him too much, which prompts him to move and actually start his day. No. Now, instead of the simple pleasure of slow mornings, he has to hear the shrill alarm of one precious doctor at the ass crack of dawn. Once he wakes, there's no going back to sleep, so Aventurine starts his mornings before the sun decides it is indeed morning yet. That brings about number 2. Aventurine no longer has the house to himself, or even has his house at all. Well, technically, yes, he still has his house, a sizable flat tucked into a complex not too far from the Strategic Investment Department's headquarters. It's just that he is not as often in it as he is out. "You should stay with me," Ratio had argued after shaking him awake out of the dream pool. "They won't look for you there." It had surprised Aventurine the most when he agreed without protest, nodding along, half sure that this was yet another dream in a dream. Yet, if this was in fact another dream, surely there would be no alarm digging into his brain, demanding attention, and there would be no consequences. It's not only the alarm that breaks off his sleep, in truth. It's just the most common one. And to Aventurine, it's preferable in its predictability. It's every day at 5:30 a.m. on the dot. Number 3. The nightmares. Yes, surely, if this was a dream, the dreams within them wouldn't work overtime to torment him in his hours of rest. Today, however, subverting from the already changed routine, the alarm doesn't shut off. It goes on for 2 minutes and snoozes itself, only to come back alive 8 minutes later. "Ratio," Aventurine whines after the 3rd cycle of alarms, and then forces his limbs to cooperate with him as he pads his way into Ratio's room. "For the love of the Amber Lord, Doctor, would you shut that thing?" When he reaches for the door, it's already left ajar. The phone is sitting perfectly in place on the nightstand, with Veritas Ratio nowhere in sight. Aventurine halts by the doorframe and blinks, rubbing his eyes to clear the view, in hopes that Ratio will materialize where he expects him to be. Except he doesn't. Except that he doesn't. And the alarm keeps ringing, shattering any sleepiness left in him that might cause him to be illusioned. He makes his way towards the nightstand, and even with the doctor gone, it feels like a violation of his privacy. He shuts it off with tentative fingers, feet ready to bolt out of the room at the first sight of the other man. But the room stays as silent as ever. With a sigh, he turns the phone away from himself before he can get any ideas, and leaves the room. Veritas Ratio is a strange man. He irons and folds his socks. He insists on the both of them getting 3 full, nutritious meals a day, even though neither of them can really cook, and that much synthesizer food in one day doesn't really taste all that nice. And most importantly, he is diligent to a fault, leaving his phone behind to do Quipoth knows what at an hour even he should still be asleep is concerning. It's worrying, Aventurine realizes with a lump in his throat that he can't seem to swallow away. He is worried. Number 4. More often than not, Aventurine finds that the troubled gaze Ratio sends him on nights when the memories that wake him aren't really quiet is reflected on his face. When Ratio comes home late, when he can tell someone bothered him about the Genius Society, when his issues with Nos draw up on their own, when he shut himself in his room and refused to come out, even for the rule of 3 meals a day he himself had set. Without the looming threat of the IPC catching up to him, hardened thanks to his nameless friends, Aventurine realizes he has a lot of empty space in his mind to worry about someone else for a change, and that more often than not, his mind strays to Ratio, eager to fill that void. For the first time in perhaps quite a long time, the worries are justified, and he can't do anything about it because that stupid, brilliant man has left his phone at home, leaving no way to contact him. Aventurine seriously considers running around the city, aimless and directionless, until he stumbles upon Ratio, or maybe at least an answer. But then, his senses, and thankfully his wits, return to him, and he decides that being calm about this might be the best approach. The world doesn't stop spinning just because Aventurine feels this uneasy. Yet, he calls in sick anyway. His client, as most rich assholes are, mumbles something about how an independent consultant should be available whenever, but by then, Aventurine has long hung up, mentally checked out of the conversation before it even started. He's going to go stir-crazy, Aventurine thinks. The more the hours pass, the harder it is to keep his head on straight, pacing on the kitchen tile like it will bring Ratio home sooner. He doesn't even know why he's so worried about this. Maybe Ratio just had an early start to his day and forgot his phone at home. But something in his gut is telling him that it's not the case, that something awful is happening. Or has happened. What if he never comes back? What if he's bleeding out on some dirty alley and he's... Keys jingle outside their apartment, and Aventurine almost trips over the fuzzy rug in the entry, racing to the door. Number 5. Somewhere along the way, living with Ratio has transformed into caring about Ratio. That comes with very many weights tied around Aventurine's ankles that he dares not address. But seeing his fears come alive, in the bloody stature of Veritas Ratio leaning against the wooden doorframe, the weight is tugging at his heart instead. He's grasping his left arm with his right hand and is carefully shifting his weight on just one foot, and the horror of it all must show on Aventurine's face, because a frown forms on Ratio's. "Aventurine, where the hell have you been?" he rasps out, shifting Ratio so he can come inside, while patting him anywhere his hands can reasonably touch, surveying for more injuries than initially meets the eyes, but doesn't find any. Ratio, to his merit, allows the frantic hands-on examination, however half-assed it is, and just sways a little on his feet. Once Aventurine has calmed down enough to regain the self-awareness he threw away the second he had seen Ratio, he recoils, like he's been burned, fingers scorched. "Are you quite done?" he asks, voice sounding steady in spite of the blood coating his arm, and the opposite hand, wrist, elbow. It must be quite the deep cut if he's still bleeding, all over the light hardwood until that stains too. All Aventurine can muster up as a response is an offended scoff, so he takes Ratio by the shoulders and practically drags the man into the bathroom, Ratio stumbling and wincing as he goes. When Aventurine eventually gets over the shock and his mind clears up a bit more, he's going to beat himself up over the crick in between Ratio's eyebrows that he caused. But there is no time for that right now, and Ratio looks mostly fine when he sits on the closed toilet lid anyway. "You should be at a hospital," Aventurine says, kind of breathless. A scoff is imitated by Ratio at that. "I am a perfectly capable medical doctor, gambler. Or have you forgotten already?" Aventurine wants to yell at his dismissive tone, or of how lightly he brings up the nights just after nihility, where Aventurine was too weak to do anything but lift his own limbs, that Ratio had nursed back to something resembling health. But before he is angry, he's concerned, so he doesn't take the bait. "You can't operate on yourself. Even the great Dr. Ratio has limits. I do not require an operation." And with that, he bends down to reach for the readily available first aid kit under the sink. Aventurine feels like he's been stunned, moving through oil, before he jerks himself into action and snatches the bandages from Ratio's hand. Ratio blankly stares at him, to which Aventurine stares back. "What?" he asks defensively. Ratio sighs, breath shakier than Aventurine would like. I am not as useless as to not wrap my own wounds myself. I want to help, Aventurine blurts out, neon eyes no doubt shining. I need to help. I need to do this. Let me do this. At that, Ratio closes his eyes and tips his head back, breathing out and surrendering control. He takes his right hand back from where it's been compressing the cut, a silent invitation, and Aventurine quickly stands up to find the clean rag and wets it in the sink behind him. He grabs Ratio's arm, lower and on the backside so as not to aggravate the wound further, as he cleans the dried blood and still running blood from his arm. Ratio hisses every now and again, but even with his eyes now open, he never strays his gaze from the ceiling. What happened? Aventurine asks, his hand going for the gauze, and that finally makes Amber eyes turn on him. Ratio opens his mouth, but then closes it, seemingly thinking of how to word what he wants to say. It's odd, really, the apprehension, for as long as Aventurine has known him, Ratio has always spoken his mind, often without a brain-to-mouth filter ever present. Aventurine chews on his lower lip as he wraps the gauze tightly around Ratio's arm, still damp, as he'd been taught, so it doesn't pull on the cut as much. I had a bad day, is what Ratio settles on after a long few seconds of deep contemplation, and Aventurine doesn't have the heart to press him on this further, not when he sounds genuine and honest, not when he sounds so tired. Okay, he says, and gets up, with help from his hand on his knees. Let's get the bath running, then. That is not necessary, Ratio argues, trying to get up, but he groans in pain as he puts weight on his ankle. It makes all of Aventurine's attention to immediately zero in on that spot, crouching once more after he turns the tap on. Sprained, I think, he tries, to which Ratio swats him on the head, touch light as a feather. However could I have figured out that vital piece of my diagnosis without your much-needed input, gambler? Oh, hush, he says, dropping the leg he had been examining and dipping a finger into the rising water to check the temperature. Once he's satisfied, he goes back over and starts undoing the binds holding his sashes in place. This time, the impact of skin on skin is harder as Ratio slaps his trembling hands away. Would you let me preserve a fraction of my dignity, or must you insist on making me miserable? To that, Aventurine smirks, saccharine, glad to find his footing on the familiar ground of their banter. Why, doctor, perhaps this was all a ploy so I could undress you myself? He really expects the scoff that follows. Incorrigible. He laughs, and it's a bit forced, but he can't be found at fault for it, as he turns around and leaves Ratio to it, shutting the door with a quiet thud. All too soon, Aventurine realizes that his feet won't carry him to his room, and that he's stuck just outside the door, waiting for something, anything, that will warrant his return to the rapidly steaming room. Aventurine decides he owes it to himself to be brave for once, and knocks on the door thrice. Need any help in there? He doesn't hear a reply for a good minute, a minute that makes worry rise up like bile in his throat. So he tries again. Ratio? All good? When that inquiry goes unanswered, too, Aventurine makes the decision. I'm coming in, all right? And he opens the door. He finds Ratio sitting in the tub, with his knees drawn close to his chest, arms hugging his legs, completely dead to the world. There is that sinking sensation in his stomach again, so Aventurine moves where he can to sit next to the tub, facing Ratio, one hand dangling by the edge, creating tiny ripples in the water. He's mindful not to disturb the single rubber duck floating about, but otherwise keeps his eyes on Ratio. He's beautiful, Aventurine thinks, even disheveled and bleeding out, and upset, Ratio is the most beautiful man he's ever seen. And isn't that such a tragedy? To want and to know and to be unfathomably far away from it all. Veritas! He pleads, and that catches the attention of the doctor almost immediately, eyes snapping over at him, as hands grab his legs tighter, leaving white indents where they're nestled. His grip relaxes when he seems like he registers that it's Aventurine in front of him, and not someone else, and his shoulders slump. Aventurine squints at the sight. It's quite possibly the first time he's seen Ratio with less than perfect posture. You always say my name wrong, he complains. His lip twitches in something that could, with time, form into a smile. The stress is on the wrong syllable. 0 points? Ratio hums. Just the 2. With your class average, Doc, I think I might just be on par. To that, Ratio shakes his head. Nonsense. You are nothing like those imbeciles. High praise coming from you, Aventurine says, glad to see some of the tension leave Ratio's stance. Ratio just hums again at his response, although he looks calmer, like the bath is actually soothing him, instead of him simmering in the water helplessly. Ratio detaches one of his arms from his legs, the injured one, and raises it up so the bandage doesn't come in contact with the water. Your assistance isn't necessary, Aventurine. I am perfectly capable of accomplishing this task myself. Ouch! Do try to spare my feelings, won't you? Aventurine puts a hand on his chest, feigning heartbreak in his usual dramatic fashion. All he gets for his troubles is the shake of the head and unintelligible mumbling, of which Aventurine can easily translate to mean incorrigible. Have you thought that maybe I want to do this then? He asks, and Ratio raises a curious brow. Help, I mean, you've done for me when... You've done this for me when I needed it. You were 2 steps away from death's door in those instances. I have a cut-up arm. Ratio argues, like Aventurine isn't getting the answer to a very obvious equation. I thought we didn't need big reasons to call for help in this house. Or is that right reserved only to helpless little old me? Ratio huffs and looks away. Do not belittle yourself for my sake, gambler. I do not want your pity. Aventurine flicks some water at him. It's not pity, and you know it, Ratio. He doesn't look at Aventurine again, but he doesn't retaliate either. Small victories. Maybe so. I don't need to know what happened, all right? I just want to help. I know you're not lifting that arm and washing your hair anytime soon, so allow me to make myself useful, yeah? Like you remind me all the time? Ratio stills at that, caught, and turns his head to look at Aventurine. But Aventurine is ready with a clean rag in his hand already. He catches Ratio's chin easily and brings the cloth to his eyes, cleaning the smudged-up eyeliner there. Ratio catches on quick and closes them, and Aventurine tries not to mourn the loss of eye contact too much. My words have left you insecure in your place here, Ratio says, voice tight. It's not even posed as a question, but just a statement of fact. It was not my intention. I apologize. In truth, you are the furthest from useless out of everyone I've met. Such sweet words, Aventurine coos, a not-so-genuine smile plastered on his face. You take me entirely too seriously, Doc. You're wrong. Ratio shakes his head, even against Aventurine's hold. I think you aren't taken seriously enough. Aventurine abandons his duty of cleaning Ratio's face then, done with the task anyway, and almost lets the rag fall into the water, with how earnest Ratio sounds, like he believes in that wholeheartedly, like it's a fact he'd spent his lifetime and at least a quarter of his doctorate studying. This time, It's Aventurine who breaks eye contact, and when he looks back, he finds Ratio is no longer staring at him, but at the water he's submerged in instead. The air feels heavy, charged with something Aventurine can't name. As he reaches for the shampoo bottle and pours water down Ratio's hairline, he's transfixed on the weight of it all. The lump in his throat returns, and, once again, doesn't succumb to his pitiful attempts to swallow it down. Aventurine lathers the shampoo on his hands first, then puts them in Ratio's hair, and pretends not to hear the content sigh Ratio gives for both of their sakes. He's the most relaxed Aventurine has ever seen him be, and that twists something in his chest, tugs and pulls, and refuses to let its presence go unnoticed. I was worried, he let slip, but Ratio doesn't react, not in any way Aventurine can track at least. You were gone, and you didn't even take your phone with you, and... Aventurine? I don't know, okay? We don't do that. I know we're not each other's responsibilities or whatever, but we tell each other things. I thought the worst. Ratio manages to catch his wrist and stop his scrubbing, and Aventurine goes with it, lips ending up shut. It seems I have been betraying my intentions a lot, as of late, Ratio says, and where his fingers have encircled his wrist burns, and comes alight all the same. Aventurine swallows and nods for him to continue, feeling pathetic that he's reacting this way. I thought I would be back much earlier, and admittedly in better shape. I didn't mean to worry you. It scares Aventurine that Ratio doesn't play his worry down, because that means that there was something to worry about, which has Aventurine trembling minutely, something he finds the need to suppress, and that he is fine with the knowledge that Aventurine cares about him enough to pace in his absence. It's frightening, having your affection so clearly acknowledged, but not outright mentioned. If I didn't know it to be impossible, Doc, I would have said you're fond of me. Ratio lets go of his wrist, and Aventurine quickly resumes his duty, now rinsing the man's hair. A reply doesn't come soon, and even when it does, it's almost too quiet to catch. Not half as impossible as you assume, dear gambler. Aventurine pretends not to hear it, and Ratio doesn't take it upon himself to repeat the phrase, which means that, soon enough, they're done. Ratio is thoroughly clean, and the water is running cold, so Aventurine helps him on his way out of the tub, making a point not to stare where he shouldn't, and helps him into a set of pajamas, and then Ratio's bed. You really won't tell me? Aventurine says, when Ratio is safely tucked into bed, a last-ditch effort he doesn't have a lot of hope in. Ratio thinks about it. Not today. He compromises. And it's okay. Really. Ratio, despite his anxieties, is okay. And Aventurine has all of tomorrow to pester him as much as he wants.